Millionaire woman got stranded in the rain. A poor janitor helped her and everything changed. The rain began as a gentle whisper against the windshield of Victoria, Sterling's black Tesla Model S, but within minutes, it had transformed into a relentless downpour that seemed to swallow the entire world in gray. She was driving through the industrial district of Detroit, a part of the city she rarely visited, returning from a late-night board meeting that had run far longer than anticipated. Victoria Sterling wasn't just wealthy, she was a self-made empire. At 38, she had built Sterling Industries from the ground up, turning a small tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation. Her penthouse overlooked the Detroit River. Her closet was filled with designer suits, and her calendar was booked solid for the next 6 months. Success, she had always believed, was measured in zeros at the end of bank statements and the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. But tonight, as the storm intensified and her car began to sputter, Victoria found herself in unfamiliar territory in more ways than one. The sleek vehicle that had never failed her before suddenly lurched, the engine coughing like an old man struggling for breath. Warning lights illuminated the dashboard like a Christmas tree, and within moments, the car rolled to a stop on the side of a dimly lit street. She sat there for a moment, watching the rain create rivers down her windows, the sound of thunder rumbling overhead like the growl of some ancient beast. Her phone showed no signal, a dead zone in this forgotten corner of the city. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who controlled a technology empire couldn't even get a basic cell phone signal. Stepping out of the car was like stepping into a cold shower fully clothed. The rain immediately soaked through her expensive wool coat, her silk blouse clinging to her skin within seconds. Her Italian leather shoes, which had cost more than most people made in a month, were ruined in an instant as she splashed through puddles that seemed to appear from nowhere. Street was eerily quiet except for the storm. Old brick buildings lined both sides, their windows dark and lifeless. This was the kind of neighborhood that progress had forgotten, where empty lots grew weeds instead of dreams, and where the American dream felt more like a distant memory than a possibility. Victoria had never felt so small, so vulnerable, so utterly alone. Her world of boardrooms and power lunches, of first-class flights and five-star restaurants, seemed as distant as the stars hidden behind the storm clouds. She was just another person caught in the rain, no different from anyone else who might find themselves in this predicament. As she stood there, soaked and shivering, she noticed a faint light coming from a small building across the street. It was an old office building, probably from the 1960s, with a sign that read Metro Office Complex in faded letters. The light was coming from the ground floor, and she could see someone moving inside. Desperation overrode her usual caution and pride. Victoria had never asked for help. She was the one who provided solutions, who fixed problems, who made things happen. But tonight, with her phone dead and her car lifeless, she found herself walking across the street toward that welcoming light. Each step splashing through puddles that reflected the streetlights like broken mirrors. The building's entrance was unlocked, and she pushed through the heavy glass doors into a lobby that smelled of industrial cleaning products and old carpet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh institutional glow. It was then that she saw him. Marcus Thompson was 62 years old, though he looked older. His dark skin was weathered by years of hard work, his hair gray at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who had spent his life working with them. He wore a simple janitor's uniform, navy blue shirt and matching pants, and was methodically mopping the floor with the kind of steady rhythm that spoke of decades of repetition. When he looked up and saw Victoria standing there, dripping wet, and looking completely out of place in her expensive clothes, his first instinct wasn't suspicion or annoyance. It was concern. He had worked the night shift in this building for 15 years, and he had never seen anyone like her here, especially not at this hour and in this condition. Marcus had learned long ago that life was unpredictable. He had seen people at their worst and their best, and he had discovered that kindness was often the only thing that separated one from the other. His mother had raised him to believe that helping others wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the human thing to do. He immediately set down his mop and approached her, his weathered face creased with worry. Without hesitation, he disappeared into a supply closet and returned with a stack of clean towels, offering them to her with the kind of gentle dignity that couldn't be bought or taught. The warmth of the building was a shock to Victoria's system after the cold rain. As she dried her hair and face, she became acutely aware of how she must look like a drowned rat in designer clothes, her usual composure completely shattered. But Marcus didn't seem to notice or care about her appearance. He simply saw someone who needed help. He led her to a small break room, switching on a space heater that immediately began to chase away the chill. The room was simple: a couple of plastic chairs, a small table, a coffee maker that had seen better days, and a refrigerator that hummed with the persistence of old age. But it was warm and dry, and at that moment, it felt like the most luxurious place on earth. Marcus moved with quiet efficiency, making coffee without asking if she wanted any. He had learned that people in distress often needed warmth more than they needed choices. As the coffee brewed, filling the small room with its comforting aroma, he pulled out his own cell phone, an old flip phone that Victoria hadn't seen in years, and offered to call someone for her. But who would she call? Victoria realized with a start that she had no one. Her assistant had gone home hours ago. Her few friends were probably at their own social events or already asleep. Her parents had passed away years ago, and she had no siblings. Her life was filled with business associates and networking contacts, but no one she could call in the middle of the night during a personal crisis. The coffee was strong and bitter, served in a chipped mug that had seen countless nights like this one. But as Victoria wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine gratitude. Not the polite appreciation she expressed in business meetings, but real, heartfelt thankfulness for simple human kindness. Marcus didn't ask her what she was doing in this neighborhood, didn't comment on her expensive clothes or jewelry, didn't make her feel out of place or foolish. He simply sat across from her in the other plastic chair, occasionally sipping his own coffee, and provided the kind of quiet companionship that she had forgotten existed. As the storm continued to rage outside, Victoria found herself really looking at this man who had helped her. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful way he moved his hands, the quiet dignity in his posture. This was a man who took pride in his work, who found meaning in service, who had probably never had a bank account with more than a few $100s in it, but who possessed a wealth of character that all her money couldn't buy. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who understand that sometimes words aren't necessary, that sometimes presence is enough. Victoria, who filled her days with meetings and phone calls and endless chatter, discovered the profound peace that could be found in simply being still with another human being. As the first chapter of this unexpected encounter drew to a close, Victoria realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The storm outside was beginning to calm, but the storm inside her, the one she hadn't even known was there, was just beginning to surface. The rain had softened to a gentle patter by the time Victoria's phone finally showed a signal. She had called a tow truck, and they assured her someone would be there within the hour. But as she sat in that humble break room, watching Marcus continue his work with the same quiet dedication she had witnessed earlier, she found herself reluctant to leave. For the first time in years, Victoria wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or merger negotiations or stock prices. She was thinking about the man who had helped her without expecting anything in return, who had shown her kindness simply because it was the right thing to do. She began to ask Marcus about his life, and slowly his story emerged. He had been working night shifts for most of his adult life, not because he loved cleaning office buildings, but because it allowed him to be home during the day for his wife, Rosa, who had been battling multiple sclerosis for the past 8 years. The flexible schedule meant he could help her with her medical appointments and daily care. Marcus spoke of Rosa with a tenderness that made Victoria's chest tighten. He described how they had met at a church social 40 years ago, how they had raised 3 children together, how they had weathered every storm life had thrown at them by holding onto each other and their faith. His voice carried no bitterness about their circumstances, no resentment about the hand life had dealt them. Instead, there was only love and acceptance and a quiet strength that Victoria had never encountered in any boardroom. She learned that Marcus had once dreamed of being a teacher, had even started college on a scholarship, but life had other plans. When Rosa became pregnant with their first child, he had dropped out to work and provide for his growing family. He had never looked back, never regretted the choice, never wondered what might have been. He had simply done what needed to be done, with grace and without complaint. As Marcus shared his story, Victoria found herself confronting truths about her own life that she had spent years avoiding. She realized that in her relentless pursuit of success, she had forgotten what success actually meant. She had accumulated wealth and power and influence, but she had lost touch with the simple human connections that gave life meaning. When had she last had a conversation like this? When had she last sat with someone and really listened to their story? When had she last felt the warmth of genuine human connection that had nothing to do with business deals or networking opportunities? The tow truck arrived just as the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening under the streetlights. Marcus helped her to the vehicle, still carrying the same quiet dignity that had characterized every interaction they had shared. As the tow truck driver loaded her Tesla, Victoria realized she didn't want this encounter to end. She pulled out her business card, then hesitated. What was she doing? What could she possibly offer this man who had already given her so much? But something compelled her to write her personal phone number on the back of the card and press it into his weathered hands. Marcus looked at the card with surprise. Sterling Industries. He recognized the name everyone in Detroit knew about. Victoria Sterling, the tech mogul who had built her empire in their city. But the woman who had sat in his break room, soaked and vulnerable and grateful, had seemed like someone entirely different from the powerful businesswoman he had read about in newspapers. The ride back to her penthouse was quiet. The tow truck driver focused on navigating the still wet streets. Victoria stared out the window at the city passing by her city, the place where she had built her empire, but she was seeing it with new eyes. She noticed the small businesses struggling to survive, the neighborhoods that had been left behind by progress, the people who worked night shifts and double shifts just to make ends meet. Back in her penthouse, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and success, Victoria felt more alone than she had in that simple break room. Her apartment was immaculate, expensive, and empty. The view of the Detroit River was stunning, but it felt cold and distant. Everything was perfect, and nothing felt like home. She couldn't sleep. Instead, she stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights and thinking about Marcus. Tomorrow, she would return to her world of board meetings and power lunches, of decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. But tonight, she had been reminded that the most important things in life couldn't be bought, or sold or negotiated. The next morning, Victoria found herself doing something she had never done before. She cleared her schedule. She told her assistant to cancel her meetings, to reschedule her calls, to handle the day without her. Then she got in her car and drove back to the industrial district, back to the Metro office complex. She found Marcus just as his shift was ending, tired but still moving with that same quiet dignity. When he saw her, his weathered face broke into a smile that was worth more than any business deal she had ever closed. Victoria had a proposal, but it wasn't the kind she usually made in conference rooms. She wanted to help Rosa with her medical expenses, to ensure that Marcus didn't have to work night shifts anymore, to show the same kindness that had been shown to her. But more than that, she wanted to learn from this man who had found richness in simplicity, who had discovered wealth in relationships, who had built a life of meaning without ever accumulating millions. Marcus was hesitant at first, proud and independent, unused to accepting help from others. But Victoria explained that this wasn't charity, it was gratitude. She told him about the transformation she had experienced in that break room, how his simple act of kindness had reminded her of what truly mattered in life. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself spending more and more time with Marcus and Rosa. She helped them navigate the healthcare system, ensured Rosa got the best possible care, and gradually became part of their extended family. But more importantly, they became part of hers. The change in Victoria was noticeable to everyone who knew her. She began to approach her business differently, focusing not just on profits, but on the impact her company had on the community. She started programs to help employees with healthcare costs, created scholarships for kids from underprivileged neighborhoods, and began to use her wealth and influence to lift others up rather than just to accumulate more for herself. Marcus eventually did leave his night shift job, but not to retire. Victoria had convinced him to fulfill his old dream of teaching, and with her support, he returned to school to get his education degree. At 62, he became a substitute teacher, then a full-time teacher, bringing his wisdom and compassion to a new generation of students. Rosa's condition stabilized with better medical care, and she began volunteering at a local community center, sharing her own story of perseverance and hope. The couple who had spent decades taking care of others finally had others taking care of them, but they never stopped giving back to their community. As for Victoria, she discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in relationships, in the lives she could touch, in the difference she could make. She had built a business empire, but it wasn't until she met Marcus that she learned how to build a life. The storm that had stranded her that night had been a blessing in disguise. It had washed away her old priorities and revealed what really mattered. She had been a millionaire when she walked into that office building, but she had walked out as something far more valuable, a human being connected to other human beings, a person who understood that kindness was the greatest currency of all. Years later, when people asked Victoria about the secret to her success, she would tell them about a night when she was stranded in the rain, about a janitor who showed her kindness without expecting anything in return, and about how sometimes the most important encounters in life happen when we're at our most vulnerable. She learned that money could buy comfort, but only kindness could buy joy. She discovered that power could influence people, but only love could transform them. And she realized that the greatest investments weren't in stocks or bonds or real estate, but in the simple human connections that make life worth living. Storm had passed, but its lessons remained, reminding her every day that sometimes we have to get completely soaked before we can truly appreciate the warmth of human kindness. As he dialed Richard's number, Jake realized that the broken rope swing that had caused so much pain might also be the thing that finally brought a family back together. Not just Oliver and Oscar, but Jake and Richard as well. Brothers who had been separated by circumstance, reunited by the love and courage of two small boys who refused to give up on each other. The phone rang, and Jake prepared to say the words that would change everything. "Richard, it's Jake. Jake Murphy. I think we need to talk." The second chapter was ending, but Jake knew that the real story was just beginning. A story about family, about loyalty, about the connections that bind us together across time and distance and circumstance. A story about how sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And it all started with two brave boys who refused to let their brother suffer alone.